Hello and welcome to the GoodPractice Podcast, a weekly show about work, performance and learning. I'm Ross Garner and this is How Can xAPI Drive Performance? This is our second visit to the lands of xAPI, and this time I've assembled a new team of expert voices to give their perspectives. Author and performance strategist Ajay Pangarkar returns to the show. Hello Ajay.
Hello Ross, good to see you again.
Yes, good to see you as well. From GoodPractice we have our technical director Jonny Anderson. Hello Jonny.
Hello there Ross.
And for the first time on this show, I'd like to welcome Instructional Developer for the Internet of Things, Anthony Altieri. Hello, Anthony.
You can just call me an idiot. Everyone else does. It's perfectly fine.
I just realised idiot was the acronym for Instructional Developer for the Internet of Things.
There we go. So we just learned something today. We can move on.
All right. We've covered xAPI before in some detail, but for anyone who hasn't listened to our previous episodes, I wonder if we could start with a quick overview. What is xAPI and what does it do? I'll just throw that question to the floor. Who wants to go for it?
Sure. So xAPI, the Experience API, basically it's a framework that allows us to collect data on a user's experience, or specifically their activities, which is why we call it the Experience API. Experience needs to figure in there somewhere. But the key here is it's event driven. So when you click on the play button, you click on the next button, you click on whatever, what's going to happen is that content's going to send a statement. Ross clicked the next button. Ross played this video, whatever it may be. And as you go through a course or you go through a product, we collect these statements, and what happens is, we eventually we have enough statements that we have a stream of activity of what's happening with you, and we can actually use that to kind of recreate what you've done. The really cool thing about that, though, a mutual friend of Ajay's and ours, Katie Stroud, talks about the importance of telling a story. And with xAPI, we have these statements, and that's what a story is. It's a collection of statements that build to a point. And we can start to build that story. So in this case, we're telling the story of Ross and his experience during this course.
Ajay, do you agree with that overview?
Yeah, I do. And I think Anthony brings up a very important point, and it's the word story that is key to all of this. Because in the past, we've had reporting mechanisms, SCORM and so forth. The difference between that and the opportunity that we have at hand right now is to tell those stories and to actually put some context around it. And I think that's the power of xAPI that hopefully we'll get into a little bit of a deep discussion here. Because it's more than just the mechanics. And although the mechanics are really wonderful and you need to know a lot of the mechanics, it's crafting that story that Anthony is speaking about that really drives the value for xAPI.
Well, why don't we go straight into that then? So the idea of tracking what you're doing online isn't necessarily a new one. SCORM's been around for over 10 years. Why is xAPI an improvement?
So SCORM was state-driven. If you look at the... let's accept them as statements. When you look at the SCORM information that comes back from the content to the LMS, let's consider that a statement for conversation's sake. When you look at that statement, the statement is, and just to warn you, I'm going to continually pick on you throughout the entire conversation. So, Ross launched this course. And actually it wasn't even that. It was, the course was launched, the student is Ross. Then it goes to this, the course is incomplete. The course is incomplete. The course is now complete. It just reported the state of that enrollment, the state of that launch. That's it. With xAPI, we get what's actually going on. We get that you clicked the next button. We get that you did this, you did that. You played this video, you played this audio, you moved this piece where it was supposed to be, you matched these two answers, whatever the activity is. This is more event-driven because those are sent when that event happens, when you click that button, when you play that video, whatever. That gives us not only a more accurate indication of the time, how long it's taking you to do these things, when you're doing them, but we can also get very arbitrary in our detail. What was the environment? What operating system were you on? What version of Windows? Or a real operating system like Linux or Mac OS, for example. What was the screen resolution? What browser were you using? What song was playing on WKRP at the time? Whatever information we want. If we can collect it.
Can you?
Hey, there's other APIs. We can work magic. On the web, everything's possible.
But what's the reason for gathering all this, though? There is a push just now to gather as much data as you possibly can. And then what happens next? Who cares?
Well, the WKRP song, I don't know what the point of that is. I don't know. We're tracking how many people listen to the Beatles, I guess, maybe. The rest of it, though, we can look at for example, what environment is being used. If all of our students are using Chrome and they're not using Internet Explorer, we don't need to support Internet Explorer anymore. If people are playing a video 3, 4, 5 times, well, that's either a really good video or a really bad one. Because people are either watching it because they enjoy it, or they're watching it multiple times because they're not able to consume what that video is trying to convey. So they have to watch it a few times to ferret that out. So with this data, we can find out what part of the course is working, what part isn't. We can go back and adjust the course. Or what's really cool is we can actually have the course self-adapt. By looking at your activity, we can actually have the course self-adapt to meet your needs. Or something that we'll get into a little bit later, using some external data, we could actually have the course self-adapt based on your previous performance.
Jonny, I know that you're a big fan of data collection. Do you have thoughts on the reason for collecting data that possibly you don't even know what you're going to use it for yet?
Well, I mean, that's one thing. You want to be collecting as much as you possibly can, given that it's so cheap to store these days, because you don't know what use you're going to put it to. There's a whole bunch of machine learning tools that are being developed that require data, and so you better make sure that you've got it. You don't want to be stuck 2 years from now with the last 2 years of data sitting in the bin. So you collect data. That's just an insurance policy. What I'm interested in doing with that data right now, though, is something useful, I hope anyway. That it's an extension, really, of what's just been described, because everything that we've said about xAPI so far has been constrained by thinking about it in terms of the learning environment. But I like to think of it slightly more generally than that. What we're talking about here is analytics that apply to any experience, any website experience you might have, indeed any software experience that you might have. If you can store the state transitions, if you can store the differences between one state and another state, then you effectively can rewind time. You can go back in time. With a piece of software, you can put those state transitions, run those state transitions through your piece of software, and see exactly what that user was doing, like you'd videoed them. And that to me is interesting for two main reasons. The first is because you get some very detailed analytics on what the user has been doing, and for those reasons that have just been given, that's a great idea. You discover what they've been up to. But a second reason from a coder's point of view is that it gives us a really amazing way to reproduce bugs when a bug is reported. If I can pull my xAPI records down and those faithfully reproduce the precise state transitions that the user has gone through, and that's quite a big if, it has to be said, but if we can do that, then what you should get, is you get driven straight to the scene of the crash. And once you're there, you can forensically examine it, and that will make an enormous difference to the speed and capability of the people who have to debug live problems.
Yeah, and actually I want to jump on that, because that's something that I've been trying to work with, is if, say you're taking a course or whatever product you're working on, to John's point, it doesn't have to be a course. In fact,
I was going to ask about that. We kept using the word course.
One of the projects I have sitting over to my right is a very dear friend of mine named Frankie the Forklift, which is a remote control forklift that sends xAPI statements based on activities. But one of the neat things about this is, because you can get arbitrary detail, to Jonathan's point, if now I'm having trouble and I call into the help desk could go to the LRS, the Learning Records Store, the LRS, and get, oh, okay, well, this is the environment you're using, this is what's going on. Now they have some of that data for support. So we can actually tailor our support, because I don't know if you've ever had to work help desk. People call, what browser are you using? I'm using internet. Well, okay, that's just a link on your desktop. What does it actually go to? It goes to the internet? You should know this. Okay. Now we can actually get that information. We don't have to ask about versions or anything. We can just get that information.
We have to be careful for a second, though. I do agree with everything that's said, but one thing that, and I'll sort of isolate L&D right now. One thing, and I'm being generalistic, so I'm going to qualify my statement, but we are wonderful at data hoarding, and we're not really good at data application.
That's what I was afraid of, yeah.
And that's the thing, and to Jonathan's point, it's important to have, that accumulation of knowledge and data, but we mustn't forget that data also gets stale. So we have to also, there's a lot of things that we have to balance here. First of all is the staleness of the data, right? So, technology changes very quickly. We have new technologies that come into L&D quite often. We seem to think these are the miracle cures of everything that we need to do and address business needs. But at the same time, the more technology advances and the more applications change, the more the old data gets stale. So we have to be, I guess what I'm looking for in a word is astute, to understand what is relevant, what's not relevant. Because what we're doing here is actually, in performance management terms, we call it benchmarking, right? And actually, as you know, Ross, I'm a CPA, so benchmarking in the financial terms means that we have to find that baseline of where we're going to improve performance and what knowledge is going to contribute to that without skewing the results. And so we have to be very careful. XPI is simply a tool. And I don't want to, degrade the value of that tool. It's not at all. But I use this analogy a lot of times with people. I could use a hammer to put a screw into a wall. It will work. It won't be effective and it won't be pretty, but it will work. But a more effective tool will be a screwdriver. So, we have to use the tool appropriately and make sure that we are addressing and building, again, going back to the beginning of this conversation, what Anthony said, crafting a story. Because at the end of the day, we're trying to deliver some sort of results or some sort of outcome.
I would agree with that completely. First of all, to address the problem of stale data, the problem that we would face if we were hoping to rewind the state data that we'd saved would be that each statement would need to be associated with a version, and you need to make sure that you only ever applied it to the correct version. We release versions all the time, of course, so that's and those need to be synced together. And that's interesting you should bring that up, because that was only mentioned for the first time to me. It was a surprise to me about 2 or 3 days ago. One of my developers said, "Oh, by the way, here's something we haven't thought of," and I was like, "Of course." I mean, it's so obvious when you think about it, but you can't replay state through newer code. So that was the first thing. The second thing was that xAPI doesn't give us all of this stuff that we've been talking about, because xAPI is just a logging mechanism. That's all it is. And you could write your own logs that could do all that. You being a walled garden, of course, you wouldn't. For me, the real beauty of xAPI is it's a standard, and it's a standard that people are beginning to adopt. There's more I can see, or I'm seeing some grimaces. Are they not? Is it not being adopted, Anthony?
It is technically. I am required because of my associations. I cannot describe xAPI as a standard yet. It is currently a specification. We are working with the IEEE to make it a standard, but until a standards body accepts it and acknowledges it, it's technically a specification.
Well, thanks for that clarification. That's really useful. I didn't realize that. So the specification, which nonetheless is being adopted by at least some of the peer organizations that we've got at GoodPractice, the promise that we've got, the thing that xAPI really gives us, is the ability to join up the user experience across machine boundaries, or at least across application boundaries. So by that I mean, if someone comes in from company A and they're using GoodPractice as a service provider, then they'll typically SSO and they'll use the security single sign-on security to jump into us. Now that would create a black hole normally in their ability to determine what their user had been doing. Is for all the time that they were in GoodPractice, we might be saving analytics, but they don't have any access to that normally. But if we save our analytics as xAPI records, and they save their analytics as xAPI records, and they make sure, as they must do when they SSO into us, they provide us with a unique ID for the user, then we can stitch together both of those records, and all of a sudden the black hole disappears and you get a continuous user experience record as you jump in and out of service providers, and that is really exciting to me.
It's exciting in that it is a great way to improve digital products, and I think throughout now we've been talking about how we could improve courses, or in the case of the Good Practice Toolkit, improve self-serve website. It doesn't necessarily track any improvement in performance. So where does that come? Because Netflix spends, millions of dollars on improving their product to make sure you keep using it. It's not necessarily making you better at your job, though.
Well, at the end of the day, organizations are about performance improvement. And our role, as I've said in the past, in these podcasts, the Good Practice Podcast and other podcasts,
other podcasts.
Our role, there's none other exists, Ross. I'm sorry, it's sacrilege. Anyways, no, but going back, at the end, now you just may lose my train of thought here. Performance, we have a role to play in L&D, and that is to improve performance. It's never about learning. Learning, again, is the vehicle to take us to improving performance, and we tend to focus on learning. Now, here's where it gets a little tricky, because xAPI allows you to craft that story and provide a more in-depth look or insight into how to address those performance requirements that the organization needs to improve or to address. So, as I've always said in my sessions, the answers, it's like, you're given a test. If you're given a test in school and the teacher said the day before, here's all the answers, well, you probably, find it easy to match, what questions need to go with those answers. Well, in organizations, the answers are actually given to you. The organization has what we call, key performance indicators or metrics. And Jonathan said it before. We talk about the huge streams of analytics that is happening. A new fancy word to say that there's a lot of information that we're analyzing and assessing to make sure that we can address the right issues within the organization and improve the right things to move the organization forward. So those KPIs, key performance indicators or key performance metrics, are what we need to tie our xAPI story to. So learning can now craft something that Anthony said before that we can adapt and evolve over time to meet the needs of the organization. Because keep in mind, those KPIs and those issues or those performance expectations do not remain consistent, or constant, I should say, not consistent. They do not remain constant. The organization is a living, breathing mechanism that changes constantly. And because of that, and even more rapidly than ever before, when Amazon, or you mentioned like Netflix, or any of these organizations decide to, just, clear their throat for any reason, the market goes into a spin. And so all their competitors start freaking out. And so these changes happen not on a yearly basis, probably could happen on a monthly basis, on a daily basis. And so you need to craft a message in xAPI to be able to address current issues and evolve with that. And there's the power that xAPI offers you.
Well, how's that different from with any kind of intervention that you're going to have? You would normally set some sort of KPI from the outset that you could measure afterwards. So why is xAPI better than other metrics?
Well, for xAPI, think of xAPI as the lingua franca. It's a primary language. It's a primitive primary language. It's a common language that, as Ajay was talking, he's talking about things that matter to managers, to HR professionals, to accountants. Very few of these things mean much to L&D folks, and they mean nothing to JavaScript. JavaScript doesn't care. What xAPI does, though, is it gives us a common syntax. It gives us a common way to build statements that can be universally understood. The data that is contained in there can be universally contained, conveyed, and understood by multiple parties. So whereas SCORM was very strict in how you had to do things, IMS, Netflix has their own little standard that they use. All of these, proprietary or open, are, can be fairly strict, and they have some rules and regulations that are put in place. xAPI, and if I'm honest, the most recent version of IMS, Caliper too. But xAPI is very open. It's a syntax. Think of it as, we're all speaking English. But I guarantee within the course of a day, maybe even within the course of this conversation, we're going to use a word, and I'll just pick on bacon, that In Canada, it means one thing. In America, it means another. Youth. In the UK, oh, I'm going to go up to my flat. To an American, to your what? That's an apartment. So you can have these different, you have the syntax that can have different verbiage. It can have different, different words, different verbs, different objects, whatever. But it provides a universal syntax to convey that information. And if we know that the syntax, the data will always look like this.
It includes universal syntax to an extent. So yes, it includes universal syntax, but context is so important to the way that those statements are generated. So you give the UK-US example, but once it gets out of the area of expertise, say, it's just it could be junk that's being sent to your organization, and then you get swamped with data, and this is the danger with just hoarding all the data that you can get if you don't know how it's been generated.
Right, I was going to say, this gets back to Ajay's earlier point. This is where L&D has to kind of come out of our show. We have to come out of our office, and we have a seat at the table. Whether we choose to sit at it or not, that's on us. We have a seat at the table. We have to go to that seat, we have to sit down, and we have to ask everybody, okay, well, we have all this data. How does it help you? We have all this data. What's missing? What more do you need? And then now HR, accounting, product management, sales, all these other groups can look at that and say, oh, hey, wow, this is really helpful. You know what would be more helpful? Can you collect this too? And then we can go back. And to Ajay's point, companies, a company that goes a year without changing is a company that's about to fail. I mean, that's pretty much a fact. You either grow or you die. That's it. There is no in between. So as that company grows, needs are going to change, new products are going to be announced, whatever. L&D needs to keep going back to that table and saying, okay, what data do you need now? You have this new product. How is this different? What do we need to do now? And we have to keep crafting those statements to contain that data that's needed.
So I feel like a massive leap for most L&D people. It sounds like you need to be a data scientist almost.
No, Ross. This is where this is where I get a little controversial, and I know people, and you're going to get emails, or I'm going to get emails. But here we go. Okay, let's hang on for the ride. Ready, Anthony? Jonathan?
Hold on.
Okay, hang on. Okay, L&D is way too closeted. They need to come out. I mean, at this point, L&D sits in their little cubicle, as Anthony said, waiting for the problems to be brought to them. And at the end of the day, L&D is required to go out there and discover what those performance issues are. Believe it or not, first of all, I'm going to sound like I'm repeating myself here, but the performance management frameworks in organizations include something called learning and growth. It shows that learning within the organization is a strategic, if not a significant plays an operational role into the organization. And guess what? Those leaders expect you to play that role. I wrote an article about saying, if they cut your budget, you're not adding any value. And that's actually a fact. That's not actually even personal. But if you get your budget cut, don't blame it on the leaders. Blame it on yourself, because you're not adding any value to the organization, or you're not seeing any value out of you. xAPI and any tools that you can have to craft a story to address performance expectation is one significant step for you to address the performance issues of the organization and help these people move forward. I'm writing a paper, an international white paper for CPA Canada, and CPA Canada is the Chartered Professional Accountants. They want me to write a paper about how the financial activities and the accountants of the organization can account for knowledge and learning within an organization. So guess what? This is an accounting body, a national certified accounting body, asking me to write a paper on learning for the organization and how to account for it. So it just shows you the seriousness that L&D plays within most organizations. And if I would get anybody to challenge me on this point. Every company out there that is a leading company, I'm talking about, and I'm not just talking about the tech companies, I'm talking about, like GE, Starbucks, Google's technology, of course, Apple. All these companies are leading companies not because of the reason they put out great product, is how they arrive at putting out great product, and it's because of the knowledge that they leverage within the organization. As Jonathan said, they store it, they know what knowledge is relevant, and they put it into the organization to develop some very interesting outcomes. And those outcomes are the products and services that we use and make them, billion or trillion dollar companies. What I'm saying here, I'm going too far into the deep end, but you need to craft a story, and your opportunities exist, and they're only going to get better because these tools like xAPI only are going to improve over time with technology's advancement. For some reason, as Anthony said, we just like to sit behind and whine about it, and then we whine about being order takers. Well, stop being order takers and stop being a little proactive. Start crafting an insight into your organization using these tools like xAPI to craft that story.
Well, let me jump in with a hypothetical.
Actually, hold on. Let me jump in because I'll give you an example of some of what he was just talking about. First of all, I don't disagree with anything he just said, except that the one thing I would say is the difference between an L&D department and a good L&D department is the L&D department waits for problems to come to them. The good L&D department looks for problems to solve. One of the examples, and I built this for a conference a while back, my good friend Frankie, the xAPI forklift. Basically, what this was done though is, so this is an IoT, Internet of Things project. It uses a Raspberry Pi 0W. It uses a $10. That entire thing has about, I don't know, $30, $40 worth of kit in it. That's it. That's how much xAPI costs, $40. Or at least how much it can cost. What that does, though, is, let's say, I don't know how familiar you guys are with driving forklifts.
Not as much as I'd like.
Yeah. One of the things, I used to teach CPR classes, first aid classes in a warehouse, and I would always hear one of the biggest things they'll see people do, they're driving a forklift, they get impatient, and they do, I believe it's called an elevated reversing J. Which basically what happens is, okay, let's say you need that pallet off the top shelf, you raise the forks, you grab it, you now are to reverse straight back, drop the tines, and then turn to go forward. Well, a lot of people get impatient, they lift the tines, they get the thing out the front. When they back up, they back on the turn. Now this can be very dangerous because at this point, your forklift, the center balance, it could be 15 feet in the air, and it can tip very, very easily, and I've seen it happen a bunch of times. So what we can do now with a little bit of IoT, like I said, just a little bit of kit, we can actually start sending these xAPI statements. Okay, I've identified Anthony as the driver of this vehicle via a near-field communications card or a Bluetooth beacon or whatever. Okay, Anthony started the vehicle. Anthony drove 35 miles an hour in a 15-mile-an-hour zone. Ding. Anthony did a reversing elevated J. Ding. We can do these things. Now, when it comes to training, we can tailor that training to this person. This gets us a couple of things. First off, we know who the offenders are. And I don't really want to present it that way, like, oh, xAPI is Big Brother now.
And now you get privacy issues, right?
And now we've got hey, you're working for me. I have a legal right to track that you're goofing off on my forklift.
Right. I mean, I think all these are interesting applications of data storage, of data gathering and data storage, but absolutely nothing of what you've just said there is specific to xAPI. It's just that L&D has discovered, L&D has discovered that if everyone stores their data in a reasonable way, and it has to be said that the I did this structure of xAPI, that's an actor, verb, and object structure, I think is neat. That's a neat thing. It's a great way of universally describing people doing actions. I like also the open nature. You can create your own new verbs, which allows me, for example, to create verbs that are highly technical, that have got absolutely nothing to do with L&D. But nonetheless, there's nothing about xAPI that is functionally different from me storing a text-based log file with information that says, for example, you did an elevated J. What makes it
Nobody
interesting?
ever claimed it was.
Right, but the conversations that we're having here is at least implying that these things are derived from xAPI. They're not. They're derived from the fact that we're storing information. What makes xAPI interesting to me, and it genuinely is interesting, and I think this comes back to Ajay's point about every company has got an L&D department because it's so important, right? What makes it interesting is these L&D departments can now hook up they can now join up because they're speaking the same, at least a subset of the language is fixed. It may well be that you can extend it into your own walled garden, but at least a subset of those verbs are, and this is where I disagree with Ross as well, so that's all three of you have disagreed with, which I think is pretty impressive, that it's contextless. So if I say video start, you don't need any context for that. You know you've started the video. Right, you might not know which video, or we might carry that information, but there are certain core verbs in there that are so clear that you have to be pretty pedantic to concern yourself about the context.
Oh, no, that's absolutely nonsense. No, you have the context is key. What if people have been told to watch that video? Or what if they can't move on to the next page or whatever until they're forced to watch it? Or what if they choose to watch it and they watch it 5 times, like Anthony posited? Context is key to the way that you consume anything.
Yeah, and the other issue I would say is, even what you're describing, yeah, that's a text file. I can do that all with a text file and SFTP. I don't need xAPI for any of that. What xAPI gives us is that lingua franca. It gives us that common framework, but, we can do that with any number. There's other APIs. There's other ways to do that. xAPI is one that is fairly lightweight. It's really not a lightweight API, if I'm honest, but it's fairly light-ish weight.
We're very almost out of time, so can I jump in with one last question? This is going to be a quick question, and I'll
absolutely.
let you all take a punt at it. So L&D typically does not generate tech that other parts of the business leap to use. Why would xAPI be different?
Well, I'll jump in and I'll say it's because, for me, from a coder, from a technical non-L&D point of view, because I can use it. Because L&D people, by coincidence, I think, not necessarily by design, have come up with something which is generally useful outside of the world of L&D. I find it attractive and useful. It's an easy to use, easy to understand specification. The more I talk to coders like myself, peer coders, the more their eyebrows are being raised and saying, hey, we can make use of this. So that's why I like it.
I'm gonna flip it on the head, because the reality is I think people outside of L&D can use this more than the people in L&D, if I'm honest.
That's what it sounds like.
Because it's JavaScript based, it's very open. So whereas with SCORM, it was very difficult to get into. SCORM, you had to have that connection to the LMS. It was a synchronous communication. xAPI, as long as you have some JavaScript, it doesn't even have to be JavaScript. You could do it in Perl, PHP, whatever. The reality is, a lot of people in L&D, they can only use Captivate or Lectora or Articulate, whatever. They can only use the statements that those tools allow. So it's actually outside of LMS, outside of learning. The reality is, it's probably easier to adopt xAPI outside of learning than it is inside.
Right. And last thought, Ajay?
Yeah, I agree. Listen, at the end of the day, I always speak on the business side, and at the end of the day, the business really doesn't care what you use as long as you're delivering the results that they want to see. So the xAPI, to Jonathan and Anthony's point, delivers that opportunity for the external parties to be able to communicate appropriately with L&D, and more importantly, L&D to be able to communicate externally to those parties, which is the way it should be done. So, but at the end of the day, the business really just wants to see that performance, and L&D needs to be able to use a tool that can communicate that to them. And if xAPI is the one that does it, let's do it. Either this will continue to evolve and become the I was going to use Latin, but now it just slipped my mind because I just wanted to impress Anthony because he's dropping Latin words. But it's going to, if it's going to be the standard, or something else in the next year or two is going to pop up and say, here, this is even better, and communicate even further. Whatever the case may be, at the end of the day, call it jumping jacks for all I care. At the end of the day, as long as it's communicating back out to achieve the performance expectations, that's the key. I've had examples of this in the past, but I won't go down that road right now. But in my opinion, I think it's just a good thing to have.
I think you're baiting me, Ajay, with your assertion that the business doesn't care how performance improves.
Yes, I am.
But we'll save that for another podcast because we are out of time. So very quickly, we will do a regular feature of What I Learned This Week. It's our fun ending to the show. We'll each share something we picked up over the past 7 days. Ajay, real quick.
Oh boy.
What have you learned?
Too much, and I can't even select one. But anyways, I'm dealing with some, I guess, family, personal issues right now, and I've learned how the legal system works between U.S. and Canada to liquidate property, believe it or not. I know it's probably not something you're expecting, but I'm getting into a point where I'm learning a lot of legalese and little things I didn't know, and it's quite interesting and fascinating to see how certain things function. I know this is not the most interesting topic for people, and people are going to say, what did you learn to, plant flowers? Owen likes to plant plants or whatever, and a dead garden, I like to say. But I've been learning a lot about estate wills and all this kind of wonderful stuff in the last few weeks, and it's been not something I wish upon anybody to learn, but it's quite interesting to find out, and it actually can be useful. If anybody wants to kill somebody, let me know. I'll help you with the paperwork.
Anthony, what have you learned this week?
I learned an unfortunate amount about, I will just say, certain glands on the hind part of my puppy, which now results in her wearing a cone right now, so she does not make it worse.
Jonny, what have you learned?
Well, I've always been fascinated by the crossover between mathematics, programming, and biology. And so I've been reading a book recently called Parasite Rex. It's been around for a while, and I thoroughly recommend it. And the one thing that I would take from that is just how complicated protozoan parasites can be. The classic being the malaria protozoa, and the number of, you think a caterpillar turning into a butterfly is an amazing transformation. You should see the life cycle of these things. It's quite dramatic. I'll leave it there.
Okay, you win.
Yeah, that's quite grim. I just wanted to recommend an episode of The Moral Maze, which looks at the morality of diversity. We spoke about diversity recently on this show, and I thought the Moral Maze episode was kind of an interesting follow-up to it. I'll put a link in the show notes. A word of warning, the format is absolutely horrendous. Guests are forced into a corner and then they have their views misrepresented. So it's a bit like this podcast. But it did spark some thoughts, so it's worth a listen. That's all from us. That was kind of a spicy episode, I thought. If you'd like to get in touch with us about anything we've said on the show, you can tweet me at RossGarnerGP. You can tweet Ajay
at BizLearningDude.
You can tweet Anthony
at AA_Altieri.
And you can tweet Jonny
at Biofractal.
For more from Good Practice, tweet at Good Practice or at Good Practice AUS, or you can visit goodpractice.com to see examples of some of the stuff we've been working on lately. Bye for now, and thanks guys for joining us today.